and welcome to York Festival of Ideas. So my name's Penny Spikins. I'm from the University of York and I'm chairing the event today. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, both in person and online. Before I introduce you to your speaker, for those of you in the room, can I draw your attention to the evacuation slide on the screen? In the very unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the steward's instructions and evacuate the venue via the closest available exit. So as you can tell, I've got a few things I need to tell you before we really get going on the talk. For those of you who are watching us online, don't forget that you can ask questions via this Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button there. Click on that and you can ask your questions in there, and we'll come to them at the end of the talk. Housekeeping notes will also appear in the chat, so if there's anything we need to tell you, we'll tell you that. So the Q&A button. Can I also ask everyone in the room if you can put your phones on silent for the session? Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. So we're delighted to welcome today Robin Dunbar, Emeritus Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at the University of Oxford. So Robin's a Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Anthropological Institute and an elected foreign member of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. He's been awarded the Osman Hill Medal and the Huxley Medal. Robin's popular science books have been translated into 12 languages. They include The Human Story, How Many Friends Does One Person Need, and Human Evolution. In fact, Robin has an amazing history of many scientific publications, more perhaps than anyone else I know, and a remarkable range of popular science books as well. And he's going to be talking about our latest to us today. So he's going to talk to us about his latest book called How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures. As Robin knows, every society in the history of humanity has lived with religion. In his book, Robin explores when humans developed spiritual thoughts, what is religion's evolutionary purpose, and in our increasingly secular world, why has it endured? So now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Robin to find out more about this fascinating research.
Thank you very much. Right. So yes, I'm going to talk really about, I suppose, why religion should exist at all in the context of human evolution. And in some senses, really, why it should be as diverse as it is. I mean, you might think that there should only be one religion, just as you might think there should only be one language. But like languages, religions seem to spawn offspring like crazy, and you end up with this extraordinary variety of religions that we see around the world. So I'm going to really ask, for today anyway, to try and keep this within time bounds, 3 key questions. One is whether religion has a benefit. A lot of evolutionary arguments have seen it as not having a benefit, being purely a cost that you bear, and therefore a kind of, if you like, evolutionary aberration. I'm actually going to argue that it has real benefits that have been highly important, in fact, in the course of human evolution. Secondly, when and why did religions evolve? And thirdly, why are religions so fragmented in the way that they are now? So let's start with the first one, why religion might be good for you. It actually turns out that there are a large number of individual benefits. One of the things evolutionary-minded folk tend to do is focus on benefits to the individual, because that's how Darwinian theory is kind of couched. Your personal fitness, if you like, your capacity to reproduce your genes are what drives evolution, and generically that is indeed the case. And it's very difficult, or it has been very difficult, to see real benefits at the level of the individual. In fact, that turns out not to be true. Now, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight and more research on this, it turns out that religiously active people, and I stress the word active, say they go to religious services, tend to be happier, they tend to be more satisfied with their lives, they tend to be more engaged with their local communities, they trust their local people in their local communities much more. It turns out that they have more close friends, and they are healthier. And they live longer. We'll come back and offer you an explanation as to why that be so. But it's, from my point of view, all these benefits are kind of peripheral. The real benefit in terms of the evolution of religion has not been personal benefits in that sense, but wider benefits that derive from being a member of a community. So in some sense, it's these two here that are important. And this is because humans, like all primates, and indeed many social birds and mammals, sociality is their key to their evolution. So evolution, yes, it still operates through the benefits, the long-term benefits, the fitness benefits to an individual, but for these very social species, what they've done is effectively find a way of capitalizing on group-level effects. It's now known as kind of group augmentation selection or group-level selection, in contrast to group selection, for which there is still no evidence that might occur. But group-level effects are the kinds of things that you see with cooperative hunting. So individuals can do better for themselves when they collaborate with each other. They can get bigger prey, kill bigger prey, and benefit much more than they could if they hunted on their own. That's the idea of it. Primates in general, and many mammals more widely than that, but for primates in particular, predation is the major problem they have to cope with. And group formation, group gathering together in groups and creating groups has been their key evolutionary strategy to counteract predation risk. And here's just to highlight that sense of belonging to a community, some evidence from one of our studies where we asked a number of people, how bonded do you feel to the members of your congregation as a function of the number of times you go to your religious services? So this is just a measure of, a very simple measure of feeling immersed and part of a community, that community being in this case your congregation, as a function of whether you only go once a year to church or whatever it may be, or whether you go daily at this end. And you can see the sense of belonging to a community increases very dramatically across that frequency of religious activity, if you like. So that really is, at the end of the day, the key issue. And what's very clear, if you look at some of the historical evidence in particular, that having a religious framework to a community allows it to hang together much, much better. These are based, what I'm about to show you is based on analyses we did of 19th century American communes. Forming kind of communes was a very popular activity in America, in the Midwest in particular, in America in the 18th as well as the 19th century, I guess. These are 19th century data. If you just look at the sizes of these communities, you can see there's very much a bimodal plot here. There are two different peaks. There's a peak at around 50, and there's a peak at around 150. It turns out that the peak around 50 is driven mainly by secular communities, whereas the peak at 150 is driven by religious ones. So these communities were formed very often out in the countryside, and they either had a religious framework to them, and many of the religious ones you'll know, the Shakers, famously, the Hutterites. You might even have heard of Zion City, which lasted for a long time. The secular ones were kind of socialist, communistic, derivative of Richard Owen's ideas about community life. Richard Owens, you may know because he founded New Lanark up in Scotland as a sort of community of like-minded people, socialist principles, and based on, in their case, kind of industrial complex, as it were. But he got fed up with the bureaucracy here and went off to America, where he thought he could do much better. And so here's his New Harmony community that he set up there. A lot of these you won't have heard of at all: the Harmonial Vegetarian Society, the Friendship Community. The reason you won't know about most of these, they didn't last very long. Right? The numbers at the back here are how long the community has lasted. So Richard Owen's New Harmony community only lasted 2 years, and everybody got fed up with each other and wandered off. In fact, what happened in a lot of these cases is the founder either ran off with one of the lady members and or stole all the money and left in a hurry. And of course, one of the benefits of being in a religious community is people are less likely to do that. Much, much bigger at foundation, at the site when they were founded, than the secular ones, but they also lasted much longer. So this is a slightly complicated graph, I guess, but the white dots here are the secular communities, the black ones are the religious communities, and this is their duration. This is how many years they lasted. So that's on a logarithmic scale. That's 1 year here, that's 100 years up here, but that's 10 years in the middle. But you can see that both of these have a kind of inverted U shape, meaning there's an optimal size, or suggesting there's an optimal size at foundation here, which was about 64 according to these data, for secular communities, and at their best, they only lasted something in the order of 20 or so years, often less. But you know, if they got it right, they could make it to about 20 years, whereas the religious ones had a much bigger foundation size, the optimal foundation size, about 171, and they lasted considerably longer. At that optimum point, they would make 130, 140 years easily. So there's something about having a religious structure to your community which actually makes it more stable. I think that comes from two aspects to that. One is you have a kind of policeman in the sky who, even if nobody else in the community sees how badly you've behaved, is watching you, and everybody knows that. So you're inclined to behave a bit better. But secondarily, and I think is much, much more important, is the sense of belonging that you have to the community, the commitment you have to the community and the other members of the community that prevails on you to behave much more kindly, if you like, towards them. And I think that's the big difference between these religious communities and these secular ones at the end of the day. And this raises for us the question of how we bond our relationships, not only our community relationships, but also our friendships. We do it in the same tried and tested way that our cousins, the monkeys and apes, do. It's what psychologists would call a dual process mechanism, meaning there are two completely separate processes that go on in the brain that work in tandem with each other, and they reinforce each other. And these kinds of effects and the groups they produce in monkeys and apes are very, very different to the kinds of groups found in all other mammals, or pretty much all other mammals. There are some exceptions, and even to the prosimian primates, the lemurs and the bush babies and the like, which behave much more like other kinds of mammals. Primates create these bonded groups where they're extremely stable through time. They hang together because of these intensely social bonded relationships that the members have with each other. And this is this effect is produced through this dual process mechanism, one of which is a very emotionally intense raw fields kind of effect, which is produced by this stuff here, grooming. And they spend an inordinate amount of their time grooming with each other. In some species, up to a fifth of the day is the waking day is spent grooming. Grooming triggers the release of endorphins in the brain via a very specialized series of neurons that has receptors all over the hairy skin. So moving the skin with the hands, as you do when you're grooming, parting the fur, triggers this set of neurons, which are quite different to all the other neurons, peripheral neurons you have. So all the other peripheral neurons you have, like the ones that feel pain and heat and so on, react very, very fast and have a return loop back, a motor loop back to the muscles, so that when you stick your hand in the fire inadvertently, a message goes to the brain from the receptor signal saying, it's hot, and the brain whips the message back down saying, pull your hand away. Now the so-called C-tactile neurons, afferent C-tactile neurons that underpin grooming, or part of the grooming network, are very slow. They're unmyelinated, they're extremely slow by the standards of most neurons. There is no return motor loop. And they respond to one and only one stimulus, and that is stroking at exactly 3 centimeters a second. Right? So if you do it faster, or you do it slower than that, they won't respond at all. They're really quite unique. Now, 3 centimeters a second turns out to be the speed of hand movements. I invite you to try it when you next stroke somebody. Try stroking them fast, or very, very slowly, or about 3 centimeters a second, and see the difference. What they do when they get to the brain, though, is trigger the endorphin system, and this makes you feel very relaxed. It's part of the brain's pain management system, so it's an opiate or an opioid, rather similar to morphine chemically. Makes you feel very relaxed and at peace with the world and very calm, raises your pain threshold, makes you feel very trusting in the individuals you do this with, and that causes you to stay together and makes you feel very positive towards the other person. And then the second part of the mechanism is the cognitive component, which is going on up here, which is figuring out the quality and so on of the relationship. So this is producing relationships of obligation and trust and reciprocity. That's how it's working. This mechanism is also true of our relationships. That's how we build our relationships. In case you don't believe me, here's the result of one of our brain imaging studies, which was carried out by my collaborators in Finland, which is looking at the brain here firing up in response to being stroked gently on the torso. So when we did this, we decided to do it with blokes only, and have their partners stroke them on the torso. So nowhere, not above the neck and not below the belt. And being as these were all Finns, and Finns do not get excited, as was very, very calm activity, we did it with blokes because we thought, well, blokes are much less social than the girls are. If we can show it with blokes, we can show it with anybody, right? So here they all are. Here the brain's firing up. The receptors, the endorphin receptors in the brain just going crazy in response to this stroking. Of course, we do an awful lot of stroking and touching and casual contact of that kind all the time in everyday life during conversations with our closer friends and family. We don't do it with everybody, except your hairdresser. But the reason you enjoy having your hair dressed by a hairdresser is not because it all looks wonderful when you come out. Sorry, I'd probably better leave now. It's because the stroking that goes on all the time as you're being combed and so on is triggering the endorphin system like crazy, and you're feeling just wonderful when you come out. This same mechanism explains why we nod our heads to music, and also explains why we rock babies. And my collaborators in Liverpool have shown that when you rock babies at 3 centimeters a second, it calms them down and raises their pain thresholds quite considerably. If you do it at 30 centimeters a second, nothing happens. So these play a very, very important role in our social life. But in addition to that, it turns out the endorphins trigger the immune system. They trigger natural killer cells in particular in the white blood cell system. And the natural killer cells particularly target viruses and some of the cancers. So it's perhaps not surprising at all that this system, this endorphin system, might provide the explanation for the health benefits of religion. Because a lot of the activities that we do in religious services are exactly the kinds of things that will trigger the endorphin system. And I'll come back to that and show you that in a second. First of all, let me ask first if there's an optimal community size in this context. In effect, is there an optimal size for congregations? The answer is yes. Turns out that the natural size of grouping for humans is around about 150, very close to the optimal size of those American 19th century communes, the religious ones, at foundation notice. So these are data from a very large European country that isn't here. So it's all the phone calls made on one provider. It's about 20% of the entire population, so it's about 6 million subscribers. It's all the phone calls made every year, so it's about 6 billion phone calls. And what we've plotted here is, and this is when you have to have physicists to collaborate with you because they can do all the clever number crunching. But anyway, this is what we produce, is all these little tiny little yellow dots here are these however many million subscribers we have, the number of people that they phoned over the course of a year. So they had to phone them and be phoned back in order to be included as a friend, if you like, and to exclude business calls as much as possible. That's them. The dotted line is just the normal curve fitted to that, although notice that this is on a log scale, not an ordinary scale, so this is somewhere, this is about 1,000 out here somewhere. That's 10, is that 10? That's, no, that must be 100. And that's, that'll be 1,000. But the point is that this very strong peak here, round about 150, and this number turns up all over the place. I just put a couple up here to give you a sense of the variety. So these are data on American weddings, the size of American weddings from a decade's worth of American weddings that are collated by a database. The average size is 145, and it remains very stable across the 10 years. That data set, if you look at the size of hunter-gatherer clans or communities, that's based on 2 sets of analyses. The average is somewhere around 150, 160. There's some very nice data on the size of English villages. One of them is called the Doomsday Book. So when the historians were trying to figure out how many people were living in the village, they had to do it by inference because, of course, the only thing the Normans weren't particularly interested in, remember this is 1087, William the Conqueror, they recorded absolutely every hearth, hut, horse, field, plough, but not people, because they couldn't tax people, and they were only interested in things they could tax. But the historians have worked out how many people were in the villages from the number of huts and the typical family size. It turns out it's almost exactly 150. And then 7 centuries later, at the end of the 18th century, we have very good data from parish records where you can the historians have reconstructed villages, village sizes all over England. And again, the average is somewhere around about 160. And then there's a very nice Italian data series which is the size of grazing associations or villages in the Alps, in one valley in the Alps, that runs from about 1250 AD through to about 1850. So it's a 600-year time span. The size of the villages remains extremely constant across that time at about 160. And last but not least, it turns out to be a critical number in the size of church organizations. Not being able to look at any other religion, but certainly there's been a lot of discussion on the optimal size of congregations, particularly in the evangelical Protestant tradition over the last 20 or 30 years. And what they're very clear about is that once a church congregation gets above 150, it starts to fall apart. It starts to lose people. People don't contribute so much money to the church funds and so on. If it's too small, it doesn't work. If it's too big, it doesn't work. And it's because people don't feel part of the community anymore, and the minister no longer knows everybody personally once it gets above 150. And I had a very nice demonstration of this some years ago. I was at a conference organized by the Jesuits in the Vatican, or one of the Vatican universities, on Darwinism and theology. Why had theology ignored Darwinism for so long was essentially the title of the conference. And after I'd given my talk and sat down again, this young man in a dark suit and a dog collar leaned over and tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "We are all the priests from a particular parish in Hertford, or Hertfordshire." And that's very interesting because our parish is 450 people, and we have 3 Sunday masses, 150 each, and they don't talk to each other. Right? So each one had its own priest, so nicely substructured. So this really does seem to drive the size of church organizations. So this number 150 is what's now known as Dunbar's number. So christened on Facebook, that well-known emporium of science. We also have now a huge amount of evidence to show that this number is determined by essentially the size of your brain, or at least key bits of your brain that manage social relationships. And indeed, the original number was predicted off the back of an equation for social group size in primates relative to brain size in primates. Well, there have been now something in the order of about 20 brain imaging studies which have shown that the number of friends you have, and measured in all sorts of different ways, correlates with the size of this enormous circuit here, the so-called default mode network. Originally, it was assumed to be the mentalizing network because it's what allows you to understand other people's intentions and mind states. But it turns out to be the same as what was called originally the default mode network. But it links a bunch of units up here in the prefrontal cortex, up here behind your forehead, with some units here at the junction between the parietal lobe here and the temporal lobe, and some units up at the front of the temporal lobe here. And there's a massive, great wiring system that connects these up, and then it goes down underneath into the limbic system down here. And this huge circuit, which accounts for a very large chunk of your neocortex and therefore your brain, seems to be what directly determines the number of friends you can have, or individual by individual. And this particular study here, carried out by some Korean neuroscientists, I think gets the silver spoon for this, because they sampled an entire village in Korea and then brain scanned a lot of them. And these are their data showing these 3 key areas here cropping up as correlates, best predictor of the number of friendships people had. Okay, so the question is, in some sense, is this why religions constantly fragment into cults and sects? That religion evolved really to bond very small-scale communities, because when it evolved, way back in our evolutionary history, we lived in these very small hunter-gatherer-sized groups. And this may explain perhaps why these fragments that occur, in a sense, it's kind of bubbling up from underneath the big religions. There's this constant appearance of cults and sects, often built around a charismatic leader, and particularly having mystical kind of theologies or attitudes, if like being very much based on a sense of transcendence and the possibility of meeting God's mind, if you like, or the divine principle's mind with your own mind during mystical experiences. The problem with grooming as a bonding mechanism is that it's very intimate and it's very time costly. And it's very intimate in the sense that you can only groom with one individual at a time. If you don't believe me, next time you go to the cinema, if we do these things anymore, try cuddling 2 people at the same time in the back row. I will bet you a case of champagne, one of them will leave in 5 minutes because you haven't been paying them enough attention. These touch-based mechanisms are extremely focused and intimate in that sense, and they really place a big restriction on the size of primate social groups. Primate social groups, stable social groups, don't exceed 50 in size. But humans, at some point in our evolutionary history, started to live in much bigger groups. So these are our estimates of community size based on skull volumes for all the major species of our ancestors back to the Australopithecines here 5 million years ago, when we split off somewhere around hereabouts from the rest of the African great apes. And you can see it trundles along nicely around the 50 mark here till you get to the appearance of our genus, Homo, here, and then it starts to take off. And it's taking off very fast up towards this number 50. So these modern humans down here are not us, they're fossil modern humans, and the estimate is very nicely pitched for them at about 150, where it is for us. So humans, from this point onwards, started to have a big problem, is how do you bond these increasingly big groups when the normal primate mechanism of grooming really is very limiting. And what we think happened, essentially, is that over a series of stages, we found other mechanisms for triggering the endorphin system. Laughter came in very early on, I think, because we share it with great apes, and it's very visceral. We can't control it. Singing without words, so chorusing in some form, dancing, and then once language appeared around 200,000 years ago, the appearance of anatomically modern humans, or full modern language anyway, the rituals of religion, feasting, eating and drinking together, and storytelling. And it turns out that all of these trigger the endorphin system. We've shown that all of them trigger the endorphin system and create a sense of bonding. Just to give you some sense of that for the religious ones, this is a study, or series of studies we did with our collaborators at Coventry University. We actually went round and measured pain thresholds in religious services and measured their bonding amongst themselves. And we did it with a number of different services, a number of Protestant and Catholic standard Sunday services in Oxfordshire, mainly, 4 Sunday assembly meetings. I don't know if you've come across Sunday assembly. It's the sort of religion, Sunday services without the religion component, if you like, a humanistic form of religion, but mapped onto Anglican Sunday services. The people who started it because they remembered how bonding and uplifting the Sunday services in their village churches was when they were young. My collaborators went out to Brazil and ran these studies with a bunch of Umbanda, Afro-Caribbean type religion, or a particular Afro-Caribbean type religion. It's a sort of syncretic mix of Catholic theology with Yoruba gods and some degree of Yoruba religious theology, if you like. But it's very much based around mysticism and trance states. So here's the service leader overseeing one of the principal actors in the service who's going into trance down here. Then we also did it with yoga. The yoga classes were run by this good lady here, and she ran the same yoga classes, either with a purely scientific explanation for what was going on, or with the yoga theory, theology, philosophy, if you like. So there's a religious, one set of classes did yoga as a religious exercise, the other set of classes did it as a purely physical exercise. And here are the data we get. These are the changes in the bonding index from before the service to after the service for the various churches, Protestant and Catholic churches, and the Sunday assembly groups. And then here's, just to show you that it's endorphins that are doing this, kicking this in. These are the endorphin experiments, combined the Umbanda groups and the yoga groups together. These people were given a dose of naltrexone before they went into the service or the class. And naltrexone locks onto the receptor sites for endorphins and blocks them, so you don't get the effect. So pain threshold and bonding, sense of bonding is dropping off as a result of this, whereas the people who are given a placebo, so something completely neutral, were showing the same effect as these people here. Okay, so when did religion evolve? I'm kind of not going to talk so much about when in the course of human evolution it evolved, but really the transition that you get, and that are widely recognized in the history of religions, or religion, in the types of religion you get. So there's a perception, there's primarily two phases, but I think realistically there are three. One is that all the early religions were animist and trance-based. So here, this kind of thing, these are Kung San from Botswana, engaged in a trance dance. The men circling around the fire and going into trance. The women sit on the outside, providing the music, clapping and singing. And this is a cave painting from about 3,000 years ago, I think, elsewhere in South Africa, showing what's clearly a trance dance. Here are the men. This one's got what's called a dancing stick. You can see this guy's got one here, this guy's got one here. And here are the women on the other side of the circle, clapping and singing. So this stuff has been going on a very, very long time. Then around about 8,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Neolithic, so at the end of the last ice age, you get a kind of, well, what's interesting about these religions is they have no formal theology. There are no formal gods, and moral codes are purely social. They're not handed down from on high, as it were. And there are no priests as such involved. Once you get the doctrinal religions evolving, you get what are very clearly gods. Here's an Egyptian god, the god Bes, the god of households, often specific functions in specific areas. You get priesthoods, you get temples, you get rituals, formal rituals that have to be observed. And then after that, what's kind of interesting, and we've known about this for over 100 years, is that around about 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, so that's about 1,000 BC up to the AD BC transition, you get all the major world religions as we have them now appearing almost simultaneously. And so this is known as the axial age to reflect this. And it occurs all over the old world. So the Near East and the Middle East, of course, the Ganges Plain in India, but also the Yangtze Yellow River Basin, the so-called Great Basin in eastern China. And this last stage produces the revealed religions. Here are all the major ones that we have. Many of them are kind of descendants of each other. So the Abrahamic religions all have ancestries in Zoroastrianism in Iran, modern-day Iran, for example. But a lot of them are trading ideas across the continents. So a lot of the ideas of Buddhism drifted into the Abrahamic religions, particularly into some of these, the other two lesser known Abrahamic religions, the Manichaeans and the Mandaeans. But what nobody seems to have noticed is they actually occurred all in the same latitudinal band. So this is a plot of all the major axial age religions, plus all the monotheistic religions from various parts of the world. And there are a few scattered around down here, all of which are monotheistic religions. But what's interesting about all of these, they're almost all pastoralist peoples, and they all came from the north originally. So the Himba down here in Botswana originally came down from somewhere up here, having basically acquired cattle keeping and monotheistic religion from the Nilo-Hamite peoples like the Maasai in East Africa, and then moved down as part of the Bantu expansion into southern Africa. But aside from these, but these all clearly have their origins much further north, they all occur in this very narrow little band up here, particularly, one possibly down here. This is the in Peru, essentially. The Inca religions down here. This is extremely narrow band. It's only 12% of 12 degrees of latitude. It lies just above the tropics, so it buffers the tropics here. This is the tropic of whichever it is, because I can never remember, Capricorn or Cancer. And here's the where we all are up here in the high latitudes up here. None of these religions have their ancestry up here or even in the tropics. And the question is why? So we tend to think of the tropics, and particularly the northern part of the tropics in North Africa, as being dominated by the Sahara Desert, right? Nobody can live there except for sort of camel keepers racing across as fast as they can to get to the pub the other side, basically, before their camels die of thirst. It hasn't always been like that. This is actually very new. And this is climate change big time. If you look back to the end of the Holocene, beginning of the Holocene, the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago, what you find in North Africa is massive Great Lake systems and huge rivers. It was full of crocodiles and hippos and fish and flamingos and all sorts of stuff we associate with the equatorial tropics and not with up there. And that's because it was extremely rich. In addition to that, from the human point of view, it was well away from the areas that are very pathogenic. So the tropics have a problem for everybody who lives there in that it's a breeding ground for pathogens. It still is. Almost all of them come from there. But as you get through out of the edge of the tropics here, up here and down here, pathogens' ability to survive is badly hammered by the seasonality and increasing coldness of the climate. So that's why up here it's relatively pathogen-free by comparison. And the crisis point, if you like, from that point of view, is the bottom edge of the subtropical zone, the boundary between the subtropical zone and the tropics themselves here. At that point, you've got very rich climatic environment, which things grow like crazy, and not so many pathogens. So it's hardly surprising that populations started to take off like absolute crazy at that particular location, at that particular point. And that's when people started to live in villages. Now, we've always, well, I don't know if we do have an explanation for why people live in villages in archaeology. Penny will tell me. There are all sorts of theories. But it seems to me, what I know historical sociologists have simply said is because people were killing each other, basically. Population densities got so high that the only protection they had was to live in villages. And that triggered it. It was not agriculture. Agriculture was the means to live in villages, not the reason for living in villages. So what the doctrinal religions seem to have done at this point is create that American commune, 19th century American commune setup of allowing groups to live together at very high densities without undergoing so much stress that they would end up metaphorically killing each other and causing the breakup of the group. But it raises an interesting question about why the axial age followed that quite soon. right, within a few thousand years? The answer is actually very simple. It's what's known as the mid-Holocene climatic event. So around about, sorry, that's not figures wrong. It's around about 4,200 years ago, there was a dramatic crash in the population, of the climate, all around the world. Everything became much drier and colder. And as a result, the Sahara started to appear. So within about 1,000 years, you then had massive migrations going on all over the world, and a huge amount of political and social upheaval. Remember, the doctrinal religions of the early Neolithic were all around that band, all around the old world, from North Africa, essentially, right the way through the Ganges Plain, right the way through into China. And they were producing empires. Famous one in India is the Harappan Empire up in the Ganges Plain. All these empires collapsed at the same time. And the reason seems to have been just hordes of people flooding in from all over the place. So in the Eastern Mediterranean in particular, this is associated with what's known as the Sea Peoples invasion. Nobody quite knows who they are. The Egyptians talk about them all the time because they were constantly having battles with them. But they appear to have come down from the north somewhere via Greece in particular, and they just laid waste to most of the Eastern Mediterranean. So this whole area in here was pretty much wiped out. Anything within 50 kilometers of the coast was just flattened and burnt. And you can see there are meter-deep piles of ash in the foundations of all these, the cities from that period. So my guess is, and the issue then is that very, very soon after these upheavals occur, you get the Axial Age religions coming into play. And the Axial Age religions are dominated by monotheistic concepts predominantly, and I think they are a response to try and create a much more integrated population, when the population at that point was very large. So we're talking about population units, political units of about 1 million people, and they were falling apart under the impact of these upheavals that were going on and all these invasions that were going on all over the place. So just to sum up, religion, I suggest, emerged very late in our evolutionary history, certainly not earlier than the archaic humans, the Neanderthals and their relatives, the Heidelberg folk, from about 500,000 years ago, but predominantly modern religions as we have them with us. They evolved to bond communities which are relatively large by primate standards. That the doctrinal religions arose in the Neolithic to make it possible for large communities to live together in relative peace and harmony. And the doctrinal religions are paradoxically very prone to fragmentation through the rise of cults. And this is because of the fact that it's designed to make cohesive what are actually very, very small communities, not these mega communities which people are starting to live in. So on that note, I shall finish. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. That was fantastic. So now we've got a few minutes for questions. We've got 10 minutes for questions. So I'll start with I've got some questions online, and but I'll start with some questions from the audience. If you'd like to raise your hand if you've got a question. Excellent here. Now just 1 second, because we'll need the microphone to come down to you, please.
Thank you, that was great. I've got loads of questions, but I'll limit myself. The Dunbar's number of 150, in practical terms, what do you think that means for how we should organise ourselves? So, for example, should we limit schools to that size? And are you aware of the 10 households thing in Kenya?
The what in Kenya?
10 households.
No, I should do, being as that's where I grew up. The answer, I think, the short answer, I think, is yes. I think things would work a lot better if they were done in multiples of 150. And some schools do, interestingly enough, right? So this is basically the house system in the big public schools. You eat and breathe and sleep and work with a small group of people. Now, there is an issue for schools, so I think everything should be done in units of this size. And there are some interesting examples of this. A lot of businesses are applying this principle, in fact, to the way they're organized now. But you have to remember, I think, with schools, particularly primary schools, you want to be even smaller. Because, 150 is the adult community size, if you like. For children, even teenagers, that number is going to be smaller. We don't think you get to the full 150 until you're probably early 20s. But the way you handle the structure of the school, if you're going to do it in those terms, and dare I say it, universities, is by substructuring them, the way I suggested with the parish in Hertford. So you can manage bigger numbers, but you have to substructure it. The numbers here actually are exactly map onto the structure of modern armies all around the world. They use these numbers, and they figured it out the hard way over about 300 years. You can see the structure of modern armies developing towards this figure of having a basal unit of 150, and that 150 is divided into subunits of 50 and 15, and in turn is built together to create bigger units that go up to about 5,000 15,000 in terms with things like divisions and brigades and things. So they figured it out. I wish they'd waited and then allowed me to be a consultant, because, on the fees I would have got, we would be having this meeting on my, Abramovich yacht in the Caribbean, and I would have flown you all out there. But yeah, these numbers are weird. They just seem to work better. And we showed with the Hutterites, actually. It was very interesting, because we have 100 years of fissions in Hutterite communities in the Dakotas. So it's about 100 fissions of communities, because they always split them when they get above 100, the farm, when they get above 150, because they say if the farm gets above 150 people, you have to have a police force and laws and courts and judges and things. If you have less than 150, it can all be done by peer pressure alone and person-to-person discussion. So the average size at which they split them is exactly 164, I think. And they work best if the daughter farms are either 50 or 150 out of that. If they're in between at 100, they split much more quickly again afterwards than they do if they get 50 or... Those numbers turn out to be critical numbers for the smoothness of information flow around networks. We've been able to show that mathematically that they are optimal numbers, and that's why you get these sort of patterns in the structure, both of primate and human social groupings. So yes, walk around in groups of 150. It's much better for you.
That's an answer for the future, isn't it? Now, I'm going to take a question from online, but then I'll have time for another question from the audience. So if you'd like a question from the audience, put your hand up. The person coming with the microphone can come in at the back, while I just ask this one. So we've got several questions online, and some of them group around some different topics. But one here is, what would you say is the key underlying principle behind religion that fails to be replicated by other types of community building or ideological beliefs, and why do you think that is? So what's special about religion?
I think it's the mystical component. Right? There's something weird that happens in the course of religious experiences that seems to be related to mystical trance-based phenomena. And in purely physiological terms, it seems that this is driven by the endorphin system. Lots of people do it all around the world, but some of them do it in very sophisticated ways. You think of the yoga Buddhist tradition, where it's basically about breath control, but lots of people do it in kind of hard physical ways, so sweat houses in the Plains Indians in North America, for example, or many of the shamanic things, where a lot of it's dancing. It's dancing till you are physically exhausted, but the experience is always the same. You have this sense of going into a tunnel with the light at the far end, and into another world. And in small-scale traditional societies, those trance effects, you go into the spirit world and you wander around, have spirit journeys up there. And the great problem you have is to find the hole back out, right? Because the spirit world is full of ogres who try and trip you up and prevent you finding the hole, but you have to find an ancestor who's a good spirit who'll guide you back. Because if you don't find the hole, this myth, if you like, is everywhere among hunter-gatherer societies. If you don't find the hole, you die. And of course that must have happened, because sometimes people dance themselves to such exhaustion that actually the body never recovered after they collapsed. And they must have got stuck up there, because everybody else went and came back, right? Jimmy didn't, so he never found the hole to get back out. So these experiences seem to be extremely widespread, extremely important. All religions can really have them. The Catholic tradition has a huge mystical tradition. A lot of the early sects, heretical sects, as they were viewed, were based around mystical experiences. So you have this sense of direct communication with God. All religions do it. The Sikhs have it, the Islam has it in the Sufis, Jews have it in the Kabbalah tradition, and so on. So this is extremely widespread. And I think the issue here is that what religion, this points, for me anyway, to the fact that what makes religion work, what makes people join religions, is not the theology and all the clever stuff. It's the emotional component to it. It's this emotional sense, this emotional feeling of being part of something bigger that you get from entering trance. And that's what's underpinning the extraordinary effect of the benefits that religion has in terms of creating this sense of belonging to a community.
Excellent, thank you for that. We've just got 1 more minute, so if I can just pass to the last question, please.
Hello, thanks for a fascinating talk. Is this the problem with British politics, in that Boris Johnson has been brought up thinking there are only 150 people in the world, and he forgets about the 65 million other people in the UK, and what can we do about it to change it, please? Thank you.
The answer is no. Join a religion. I think that is not a problem with a particular situation now. This is a perennial problem we have in all modern societies because they're simply too big, right? Famously, as the saying goes, we're trying to live in a 21st century world with a Stone Age mind. The answer to that is the answer to the first question. We need to restructure the whole thing. So I have a great theory of the new political structures that we ought to have, which is all built, it's very obvious, you just have parliament of 150 people, that's it. But, or 150 representatives who come out of a series of layers, but basal unit that you're electing your representatives from should be 150 people, which they were originally. It was, this is the problem. Our constituencies are based on Anglo-Saxon political units, basically the village. But now, instead of the village being 150, as it was then, it's now effectively, well, how many people are about to vote in Wakefield, or not vote? How many people could vote in Wakefield in the current by-election? It's tens of thousands, and it's no wonder most people go, what's the point? I've got no effect on central government, and one vote among 10,000, it's wasted, so why bother going? But if you had much smaller groupings who are electing representatives who went through a series of layers, and you had a much, much smaller parliament where everybody knew each other personally, so it has to be 150 people, you would get much better behaviour in the House of Commons, you would get stuff done by consensus, and everybody could be a minister. And they'd be happy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. One last... That's a fantastic way to end the talk. And just to close this, just thank you for answering the questions. Now, I'm sure many of you here are keen to get hold of the book. I've already got hold of it. I think it's a fantastic read. And that's available from the independent bookseller Fox Lane Books at foxlanebooks.co.uk/festival ideas. So that's particularly for the online people. For those of us that joined us in person, there's also going to be signed books from the book stall in the foyer. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for attending, and thank you, Robert.